The specific presentation today is based on the manuscript selected by our board of editors, titled Translocations, Maintain Genetic Diversity and Increase Connectivity in Sea Otters. The list of authors, our presenter today is Shawn Larson, lead author in the paper, but our Rod Gagne, Jim Bodkin, Michael Murray, and I apologize to anyone who I misspeak their name, Kathy Rawls, Elizabeth Bowen, Raphael Lebloy, we'll call it, Sylvain Peary, Maria Pinedo, Tim Tinker, and Holly Ernest. And as I said before, our presenter today, lead author Shawn Larson. Dr. Larson is the curator of conservation research at the Seattle Aquarium. She launched the Seattle Aquarium Conservation Research Program back in 1995, and her work spans not only decades, but a variety of areas as well. She leads conservation research projects in the Salish Sea, so near to where she is now, in Hawaii, near to where I currently sit, and soon in Indonesia. She oversees all water quality testing for the aquarium exhibits, and she leads the wildlife rehabilitation program. So she is a woman of many hats. Shawn's research is cross-disciplinary, including projects focused on sea otter ecology, marine mammal physiology, shark genetics, reef fish population biology and ecology, orca population trends, and much, much more. She is very, very broad expertise. And she's published several scientific papers on all these topics, book chapters on marine mammals, and a book on sea otter biology and conservation. And we like to ask our presenters one fun fact about them that isn't sort of the stuffy science and biology side of things. And for fun, Dr. Larson likes to ride her horse on the beach near the oldest lighthouse in Puget Sound. Now, after a quick Google search, the power of the interwebs, I have deduced that that is the Point No Point Lighthouse, which is the coolest name for a lighthouse that I have come across. Not that I know many, but it was, just for all of you, built in 1879 by the U.S. Lighthouse Service, considered to be the oldest lighthouse on Puget Sound, as stated, and marks the hazardous Point No Point Shoal and north entrance to Puget Sound. So enough of my talking, and with that little nugget of interesting history, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Shawn Larson to the SMM Editor Select seminar stage, presenting her intriguingly titled talk, Reintroductions Have Saved the Sea Otter Throughout North America. Why should we care? So welcome, Shawn. It is very great to have you here.
Thank you, Charles. That was great. And I'm impressed that you investigated Point No Point and its history. So
I'm so glad I looked it up. Otherwise, it just would have been another lighthouse, but it's just
right.
Amazing name.
Yeah, it's got a really interesting history, but let me share my screen and we'll start talking about sea otters and reintroduction.
Perfect. And thank you again for doing it. And I'm going to be quiet.
Okay. So let me know if you can see my PowerPoint.
It looks great.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again. And Charles already introduced all my co-authors that really helped out in this paper, but I want to state where they are from. So Eric Gange is currently with the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine. Jim Bodkin is retired U.S. Geological Survey biologist in Anchorage, Alaska. Mike Murray is with the veterinarian with the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Kathy Rawls is with the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. Liz Bowen is with the U.S. Geological Survey based in Davis, California. Raphael Leibowitz and Sylvain Peary are both with the University of Montpellier in France. Maria Cecilia Pinedo is in the Veterinary Genetics Laboratory at UC Davis, California. Tim Tinker is with Enhydra Consulting. And let's see, last but not least, Holly Ernest is with the Department of Veterinary Sciences and Program in Ecology in the University of Wyoming. So again, I decided and I am Dr. Shawn Larson, Curator of Conservation Research at the Seattle Aquarium. And I thought that the more catchy title for this paper is really Reintroductions Have Saved the Sea Otter Throughout North America and Why Should We Care? So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. So all of the research that I lead at the Seattle Aquarium and all the conservation efforts fall into our three conservation priorities. Those are climate resilience or climate change, sustainable seas or overharvest, and clean waters or marine debris and pollution. And I would argue that the sea otter falls into all of these categories, but specifically sustainable seas or overharvest. So why am I even interested in, well, it's easy to be interested in sea otters. They're really fantastic nearshore marine mammals that are easy to view and adorable, and then they have a really unique physiology and ecology. So, but I was specifically interested when I was a PhD student in sea otter genetics. And the reason for that is their complex history of population reductions and contractions or bottlenecks, and then recovery or expansions. So this is a map of the former historical sea otter and current sea otter range. The historical range is the dark shaded throughout the North Pacific. The current range is the lighter yellow color. And you can see here, there are still some areas of the darker shading that do not currently have sea otters. And what happened is the sea otters were extirpated through much of their range during the maritime fur trade from the early mid 1700s to the mid 1800s and early 1900s. The maritime fur trade wiped out an estimated 99% of the otters in the North Pacific. So there was an estimated 150,000 to 300,000 sea otters throughout this range before the maritime fur trade. And after, there was just these remnant populations as indicated by the red stars throughout the range. And those remnant populations had between 10 to 100 individuals per population. So the whole population of sea otters throughout the region after the fur trade was approximately 1,000 individuals. So all of the remnant populations went through an extreme population bottleneck. And then you can say, well, wait a minute, why are there sea otters here where there are no remnants? So these green stars indicate translocation efforts that occurred during the late 1960s and early 1970s. And they were all successful in establishing sea otter populations, except for this one farthest south in Oregon. That one was unsuccessful for unknown reasons. But these 3 translocations to Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, and Washington State have resulted in this continuous, almost continuous population groups of sea otters throughout this region here. So it accounts for approximately 1/3 of the geographic area of the sea otters, and also approximately 1/3 of, or up to 40% of all the sea otters alive today. So very, a conservation success story for sure, those reintroductions. So initially I was interested in, well, if you lose 99% of a population, what would happen to the genetics? So this was my PhD, and I published a paper on microsatellite and mitochondrial DNA variation in remnant and translocated sea otters, and found that there was relatively low genetic diversity within all those populations. So this led me to another paper to investigate if sea otters always had low genetic diversity or if they had higher genetic diversity prior to the fur trade. So I looked at pre-fur trade sea otter samples, and I got them from First Nations midden remains at the Macaw Ozette excavation, and found that those original Washington sea otter bones that were 600 years old actually had relatively high genetic variation compared to modern sea otters. And again, these modern sea otters, the first paper, these were from tissue samples that were taken during collections throughout the range during the 1980s and 1990s. And that'll be important in just a sec. So that also led to a paper where I investigated, so if sea otters have low genetic diversity, has that affected their health or physiology? And I looked at stress-related hormones and genetic diversity in sea otters to try and determine if the populations with the lowest genetic diversity had health implications or higher chronic stress levels than those that had a little bit greater genetic diversity. And I did did find that correlation held up. And then finally, this genetic data from the 1980s and early 90s collections was then again compared to pre-fur trade sea otters taken throughout the range. So I looked at First Nations midden remains from throughout the sea otters range prior to the fur trade, anywhere from 10,000 years ago all the way up to 600 years before present, and found indeed that all of these pre-fur trade populations had higher genetic diversity than we see in modern populations today. And that's to be expected when with the bottlenecks that occurred. So then there was a new opportunity with some new research being done on sea otters throughout their range with this nearshore study captures that occurred from 2008 to 2011. And the Seattle Aquarium and myself participated in the sea otter captures off of Washington State. And so that led to the samples in this paper. And initially it was going to be a direct comparison of the genetics of the samples taken in the 80s and early 90s to those 20 years later. But it evolved into really a discussion about the translocations and the genetic diversity within those and how that has affected the genetics of sea otters. So these are the populations that were sampled in this paper. We have samples from Bering Island, Alaska Peninsula, Katmai, Prince William Sound, and these are all remnants, as well as California, which is also a remnant. And then samples from Southeast Alaska, BC, and Washington State, and those are all translocated populations. And here are the sample sizes. They're roughly equivalent, about 30 in most, up to 67 in Prince William Sound. Total sample size was 334. And again, I have looked at 5 remnants, 3 translocated, and a little history about the translocations. So the translocation to the Southeast Alaska was founded by mostly Amchitka animals and a few Prince William Sounds. So 369 Amchitka animals and 43 from Prince William Sound. And Amchitka is out here in the Western Aleutian chain. And then here's Prince William Sound. And then the Vancouver Island, BC population was founded with a third Amchitka animals and 2/3 Prince William Sound. And then the Washington translocation was founded only with animals from Amchitka. And these are relatively small numbers of founders. And keep in mind that all of these animals did not survive the translocation. So the actual founding sample size for the translocated otters that are alive today was much smaller than that. So the methods that I used, I used 19 microsatellite variable nuclear markers, and here in 3 different primers, multiplexes. So we have primer mix A, B, and C, and that generated all of these microsatellite loci data for each population. And this is in supplement 1. And then also genetic errors and null frequencies in supplement 2. And there were relatively few of those. So the analysis that I ran, the general statistics were gene pop and gene LX, and that gives you the general stats of genetic heterozygosity, homozygosity, et cetera. Then structure, to look at population structure, I used 4 different genetically specific statistical methods for population genetics, and those are called structure, clumpbacks, tests, and Mappy. And then to look at gene flow, I looked at 3 different programs: structure, gene class, and BASAS. So to get into the results, general statistics, and this is table 3 in the paper. We'll start out with just genetic diversity estimates for the remnants. And what you see here is the remnants have, specifically looking at observed heterozygosity, expected and unbiased expected based on sample size. You have metrics in the low 50s. And when you compare that with the metrics in the reintroduced populations, those are higher than the remnants. So even though these reintroduced populations went through a second genetic bottleneck with their reintroductions, they actually maintained and even increased genetic diversity. But I have to say that even the population with the highest genetic diversity here measured Southeast Alaska, almost 59–60% heterozygosity, which is approaching the pre-fur trade heterozygosities of the mid 70%. It still is not statistically different than these levels in the remnants. So they're higher, but not statistically significantly different. Looking at the structure, the dominant structure that we found between all these populations is that California is distinct from all other sample populations. But if you look a little bit further, you also see, so this would be K equals 2, or 2 populations that structure found. There's structure also found K equals 3, which separated out Prince William Sound and California from all others as unique. And then taking it a step further, looking at K equals 4, or 4 populations, what happens here is the translocated populations group together. So BC, Southeast Alaska, and Washington all are the same color. Prince William Sound is distinct, California is distinct, and then the Alaska Peninsula and Bering populations are distinct. And even though it's distinct, though, you see there's admixture here. So there's indication of genetics from Katmai in Southeast, as well as BC, et cetera. Really the only population that stays really clean with no other admixture from the other groups is California. And then we decided to look a little bit deeper into the northern populations. And there again, Prince William Sound is distinct from all of the other northern sea otter populations, but there is quite a bit of admixture or genetic similarities with Prince William Sound in Katmai. You can see the orange bleeding in here, Southeast Alaska, BC, and Alaska Peninsula. And it makes sense with Southeast Alaska and BC because some of the animals that founded these populations were from Prince William Sound. And then another program that we used to look at structure was TESS, and the colors indicate the different genetic stock structures that TESS found. And all of these programs use slightly different algorithms to determine the best stock structure. So it found California as distinct, and the darkest colors mean the most distinctness. And then the translocated populations here, Prince William Sound, and then the others in blue here, Katmai, Alaska Peninsula, and Bering. And then here is Mappy, which takes into account the location of the sampled populations and isolation by distance. And what this shows is that you see California here as very similar to itself. So the similarity is the darker reds and the dissimilarity is the blue. So here again, California is distinct and different from all others. And it is that isolation by distance here, this area of unoccupied sea otter range here. But it also shows the connectivity between and the genetic similarity between Washington, BC, and Southeast Alaska, and then also the genetic connectivity and similarity between those from Prince William Sound throughout the Aleutian chain all the way up to Bering. And here we get into a little bit of gene flow. We use migrants, first order migrants. We used 3 programs to look at that. We've used structure, gene class, and BASAS, and all of those use different algorithms to determine the most likely first order migrants between the populations. And BASAS is the most conservative. And so even though it also had migrants that were found in the other two programs. So if we're going to believe just one program, we were going to stuck with believing Bezos, and it shows that there were 9 first generation migrants between Southeast Alaska and BC, which are essentially adjacent populations. So that's not surprising. There were 6 migrants between Alaska Peninsula and Katmai, and also 6 migrants between Southeast Alaska and Washington, 2 migrants between Prince William Sound and Southeast Alaska. Again, these are adjacent, but with some geographic distance between them, and then 1 migrant between BC and Washington. And the migrants between BC and Washington have also been shown with animals that were tagged in BC actually washing up in Washington. So there's genetic evidence of movement between those 2 populations as well as physical evidence. And this generated, if you want to look into the raw results of all of these migrant programs, that's in supplement 4A. So we concluded with this paper that as far as genetic diversity, the translocations maintained genetic diversity even with the small founder sizes. And actually the highest diversity it measured was in the translocated groups with 2 distinct founders, or evidence of gene flow, such as the Southeast Alaska populations. And then the second highest diversity estimates was actually in Washington. And we think that's because of the gene flow between BC and Washington. With structure, the dominant structure was the distinctness of California versus all others. But when you look into the further structure and the admixture, there is definitely possibly 3 different structure within the northern sea otter, the translocated groups, the Prince William Sound, and then the Alaska Peninsula and the Western Aleutians. And that has also been suggested with previous genetic data. And then gene flow or migration, we found that the successful translocations resulted in increased genetic connectivity between groups, essentially making all of the sea otter populations except for Bering Island and California connected, which is a really great conservation story. But this leads me to the question, why should we care? Well, sea otters are a keystone species, so when present, they hold the ecosystem together, even in the face of changes. So with sea otters, there tends to be complex ecosystems, kelp forests that have lots of different fish and invertebrates in it. And then without sea otters, there tends to be more simple ecosystems such as this urchin barrens. And this was played out multiple times throughout the Aleutian chain and in other areas as sea otters recovered in that area. Researchers were finding that the urchin barrens were disappearing and the kelp forest ecosystems were recovering. We're still seeing that today in areas where the BC otter population is growing, as well as the Washington sea otter population is growing. And it only takes about a year for these urchin barrens to turn over into more complex kelp forest ecosystems in the presence of sea otters. And then there's been some research on climate resilience with ecosystems that have sea otters versus those that do not. Wilmers et al. In 2012 looked at atmospheric carbon pool in areas with sea otters versus those without, and found that the kelp carbon sequestration was 10 times that in areas with sea otters versus without, and then 100 times more deep ocean transport of carbon occurred in areas with sea otters versus those without. And Rasher et al. Last year discussed climate resilience in the Aleutian chain with areas with sea otters had less change in the benthos in the face of warming ocean temperatures and increased ocean acidification than areas without. And then there's new research that the Seattle Aquarium is proposing to expand upon our 20 years of work on the coast. So we have all of these sea otter survey sites along the Washington coast, 10 sites, which is within the whole range of the Washington sea otter currently. And then we have 5 benthic survey sites that we use scuba divers to look at the benthos. And we've already seen ecosystem shifts following warm water events and sea star wasting. So we had many years of data in the benthos here. This is an area, a site that doesn't have regular occurrence of sea otters. This was prior to sea star wasting. You can see the benthos has understory algae and sponges. And this is post sea star wasting. The benthos is basically scoured clean. But not in areas where even just a few sea otters are commonly present. This is an area where there's 2 or 3 sea otters that occur. So here's 2011. I apologize for the poor visibility here, but you can see there's still algae and sponges in the benthos. And this is 2018 post sea star wasting, which occurred in 2014 and 2015 here in the Salish Sea. And it still has benthic algae and sponges. So the just occurrence of just a few sea otters can protect the benthos, even though sea stars melt and even though oceans warm. And we have a little bit of data following up on Rasher et al.'s paper in 2000, but we want to get more. And so we're proposing a new outer coast benthic monitoring program that is really going to ask, how do Washington sea otters affect species habitat associations and the resilience of subtidal systems? So our proposed research is going to pair ROVs with diver surveys to look at the persistence of kelp forest ecosystems in areas with sea otters and areas without, and look at recruitment and settlement of benthic invertebrates like sea stars, urchins, abalone, and then also larval settlement of rockfish. So this is work that we're currently trying to get funded, and we already have a couple of grants to support it. So we're very excited about that. But, and so sea otters are very important to maintaining the nearshore ecosystem, and there's more and more research pointing to that. So that's why we should care. Coming back to the sea otter range map, there's still this area, a large area of unoccupied sea otter habitat that used to be occupied prior to the fur trade between Central California and Central Washington. And post sea star wasting, a lot of this area has lost a lot of its kelp and turned into urchin barrens. So there is a move by the Alaka Alliance to bring another translocation of sea otters to bear, and they're really working hard to bring Oregon sea otters back. And I am part of the feasibility study with Tim Tinker and Jim Botkin and Jim Estes and Mike Murray and others. And we're working really hard to try and make another translocation of sea otters to Oregon a reality. And this time we hope it will be successful. And Oregon really wants to have these guys back. This is a chilling group of Washington's coast sea otters. And you can see all the seagrass and the nearshore ecosystem where they occur is just really healthy and thriving. And it's not only to reconnect sea otters, but it's to restore the nearshore ecosystem that this new translocation would do for Oregon. And let's see, with that, if you want to know more about sea otter conservation, this is a book edited by myself, Jim Bodkin, and the late Glenn Van Blaricom. And it's got a lot of good information in there. And we're going to work on a volume 2, I hope, in the next couple of years. And that's all I have. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Shawn. We are going to give everyone a little bit of time to ask questions. Again, just a reminder, if you've got questions for Shawn, put them in the Q&A box by clicking on the little tab at the bottom of your screen. If you feel it necessary, you can put it in the chat as well. But please start populating some questions, and I will give it a start. Kind of looking to the future and those potential translocations into Oregon, and I'll hold off on asking anything into sort of Northern California.
Yeah.
But I know that there is, the groups that you're working with are highly motivated, but can you speak to the broader sort of sense of other communities around there in terms of being open or ambivalent or whatever towards reintroductions, and if there are concerns, what those might be?
Yeah, so we're just completing the feasibility study now, and it'll be open for public comment later this summer and in the fall. And that we've identified, many stakeholder groups like nearshore fisheries, ecotourism, recreational fishers, the list goes on, that would be both positively and negatively impacted by sea otters. And so there was a student-led publication, a white paper that did a survey of Oregon coast residents to see their thoughts about the reintroduction of sea otters back into Oregon. And it was kind of mixed, but the majority of people were in favor of it. So there will have to be, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. The feasibility study is the first step, but then after that, there's going to have to be an environmental impact statement, and there's going to have to be many stakeholder meetings, because the last thing that they want to do is a reintroduction where most of the people don't buy into it. They don't want to have the problem with like what that happened with the wolves or the grizzly bears or anything like that. So this will be very different to the translocations that occurred in the 60s and 70s, where there weren't any, stakeholder meetings or anything like that. They just dropped the otters into those areas. And, later on, some people have been really happy about it and other people haven't been so happy about it, because these guys, they're really, they have an impact on the ecosystem in which they live because they eat a lot. And yeah, so for the most part, I think that people in Oregon will be receptive, but there's still, the Alaka Alliance and others have a lot of work to do.
Great, thank you. Questions are pouring in now. I have a bunch of them, but I don't want to hog up all the time. And we'll see if they pop up. So I guess, Eric, if you want to.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
Sure, we can reshare it if there's a slide that we want to go back to.
Okay.
And Eric, if you want to read some from the floor, please do.
Good. Okay. Thanks so much, Shawn, for the wonderful talk. First question is from Jan Roletto. How well is the translocated group at the Channel Islands doing?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't talk about that population. So that's in San Nicolas Island. That translocation occurred in the 1980s to establish a second group from the mainland California sea otter population in the case of a catastrophic event like an oil spill or something like that. And that population for a number of years, so I think they translocated, over 100 sea otters. Most of them, and it's pretty far away, the Channel Islands or San Nicolas Island is 300 miles away or so from Central California, where those otters were taken, and most of them swam back to where they were taken. So a very small group stayed. Sea otters have high site fidelity. They like to go back to where they came, and but for many, many years, it stayed very small. So for 30 years, it was 10 to 20 animals. And now the recent count is over 100. So it's doing well.
Awesome. Okay. Next question from Lisa Karn. I missed the beginning. When did the transplanting and transferring start, and what was/is the mortality rate of the transplants?
Oh, okay, good question. So the translocations to Southeast Alaska, British Vancouver Island, and Washington took place in the late 1960s. So I think it was 1968, 1969, and 1970 to 71. And the Washington was established by two translocation efforts. The first translocation I think it was about 20 animals. All of them were found dead. So the second translocation a year later, the translocation was done in a different manner in that they actually took the animals from the plane and put them in a net pen and fed them for a couple days and allowed them to acclimate to the new area, groom themselves, get some food on board rather than the first translocation. The animals were just released onto the beach and they hadn't, who knows how long they'd been in the crates, hadn't been fed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Their fur was soiled. So even with that second translocation in Washington, they estimate that probably only 10 animals founded the population in Washington that now numbers over 3,000. So the mortality rate, that's the population that I know the most about. I'm not sure about the mortality rates in British Columbia or Southeast Alaska, but I imagine the story is very similar. So probably 75% mortality, yes.
Okay, next question is from Josh McInnes. Which population will you use to reintroduce sea otters to Oregon, Washington, or California, and why?
So that's up for discussion. I would recommend, based on historical evidence in Oregon, that it seemed to be a kind of a hybrid zone between the southern sea otters and the northern sea otters. So the sea otter bones from midden remains in southern Oregon tended to be more similar to the southern sea otter in California. And then the sea otter bones in northern Oregon tended to be more similar to the northern sea otters. And in the middle, there's a mixture. So the historical Oregon otters had a genetic signature of both southern sea otters and northern sea otters. So I would suggest that both southern sea otters or California sea otters and one of the populations of northern sea otters, say from Washington or Southeast Alaska, would be good to translocate, not only to try and reestablish what used to be in Oregon, but also to get more mixing of genetic diversity and then reconnecting the otters in California and the otters to the north. So that's my suggestion, but translocating southern sea otters might be a little tricky because those are listed under the ESA as threatened. And so there's just more red tape around that. But they do have a surrogate pup raising program that could provide animals that wouldn't be able to be released in California and they could release them potentially together up in Oregon. That might work as a source for southern sea otters. And then the thought is probably taking otters from Southeast Alaska would be the best bet because that is the largest by far translocated population. Is growing. I think the last survey was done in 2012 and there were 20 to 30,000 animals then, and now it's probably closer to 50,000. So there's plenty, they haven't done a survey in a while, but there's plenty of sea otters in Southeast Alaska.
A good number for translocation. Okay, so next question from Yvonne Wright. What factors may have caused reintroduction in Oregon to be unsuccessful?
That's a great question that none of us really know the answer to, but what a lot of people, so it's been hypothesized that, which is the reason why there was a lot of work done on the historical Oregon sea otters, that the original translocation in the 60s and 70s was from Amchitka, is the northern sea otter. And some people say, well, maybe it was really the southern sea otter that was Oregon and it wasn't the right genetics or type for reintroduction into Oregon. But most of the sea otter biologists that I know think that it's because they think that a lot died, but also they think that since those animals were founded solely from Amchitka, they swam north, joined the Washington group, and you couldn't tell the difference between, none of them were tagged, and then they also had the same genetic source for a founder. So that's what we think happened. They just got lonely and decided to join the ones in Washington, probably, but it's all speculation, really.
Well, this next question overlaps with the last one. Barbara Taylor asked, any idea on why the original translocation failed? And you answered that. And she said, is there any idea on the minimum number of animals needed for a translocation to be successful? That's what you meant.
Well, the more the better. You know, like I said, over 100 otters were translocated. The most recent translocation to San Nicolas Island, and then most of them left, and some died. And so there was only 10 to 20 that founded that group, which is now over 100 and growing at a good pace now. The Washington otters are hypothesized to have started at 10, and now they're a very healthy population growing at 10% per year. But I think any future translocation, they'll probably look at genetics and make sure that there's at least 100 to 200 animals to found a new population.
Okay, next question here from Marilyn Dudley. How can we avoid some of the mistakes made in the San Nicolas Island translocation?
Boy, I wasn't involved in that. I don't know if they made any mistakes. I think it's just the behavior of the sea otter. I don't
Maybe
think.
For our viewers who are unaware, I'm also not aware. What is that event that we're referencing here?
Pardon me?
Well, what is the which translocation was this for the San Nicolas Island?
Oh, that was the one. That's the one in California.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, the one in California, and I think it's just making sure that. So I think that the mistake they made was they didn't move the otters far enough away from their home range, and they knew it, and they can swim that far. You know, they basically swam back to the mainland. And then up the coast to go back home. So I think the new translocation to Oregon is going to be far enough from the mainland otters. Also, they took adults. And so if you take these surrogate pups, they haven't established their home range yet or their home site. So releasing, young animals as a group might help with that. Then that would be home. And then, and before they would release some of the surrogate pups, I also think that they should try and establish an adult group too that was far enough away from, I that's a hard one because, the original Oregon translocation, we think swam up and joined Washington. Some of them died. So, there's otters in Washington that are, there's some wanderers that actually find themselves in Oregon now, but not a large enough group to reestablish that population. And sea otter range expansion is very slow. There's wanderers, but to get the female group with pups to reestablish is just glacial. And so that's why we really think if we want otters in Oregon within the next couple 100 years, a new translocation or reintroduction is needed.
Next question here from Davis Todd Hunter. What would it take to start the process of reintroduction to the Northern California coast?
I think it would be the very same process that the Alaka Alliance is doing, being very transparent about their goals and starting the stakeholder discussions, and then the very slow and purposeful paperwork that starts with a feasibility study and then environmental impact statement and the NEPA, which I forget what that means, but that's part of what you have to follow that in the United States with any reintroduction to make sure that the Environmental Protections Act is followed, so any reintroduction doesn't adversely affect the environment, human environment too. So it has to be shown as being beneficial for humans as well as the ecosystem. Not all humans, but many. So yeah, just being very transparent and starting the work that is needed to get local and stakeholder buy-in to the process. The Alaka Alliance is doing a great job on it, by the way. So people should go to alaka.org and check out their reintroduction plans.
Alaka.org. We have next question from Catherine Knopf. Did the translocated otters adjust their dietary preferences?
Can you say the last part again?
Did the translocated otters adjust their dietary preferences?
They adjusted them to an area that had not had sea otters for 70 years. So they, well, what we've seen in otters when they expand their range, because in the 60s and 70s, nobody was there watching them and their diet. They didn't start regular surveys of the translocated otters in Washington until 1989, and we didn't start diet observations until 2010. But this has happened in areas throughout the sea otters range where sea otters occupy a previously occupied area where they've been absent for 50, 60, 70 years. They start to eat their most abundant and preferred prey, which is usually the sea urchins. And so that's why you see the ecosystem change. The otters are eating the urchins no longer are decimating the kelp. And then once they move from eating urchins, they tend to go for the large crabs and clams. And then once those are gone and abalone, they'll move on to smaller, less preferred prey like snails and mussels. But the otters in Alaska, where they were taken from and translocated, they were eating the same thing. So they didn't shift their diet in so much as that there were novel animals that they had to learn how to eat. It was really that they were taken from an area where sea otters had been present for a while and had really wiped out a lot of their larger preferred prey. Hope that answers that.
Okay, there's one from Facebook here. I'll take, I think that's Facebook. Oh no, maybe just your chat. Where the talk, I was excited about a talk where the translocation to an estuary was successful. Do you know about that effort?
Translocation. So, oh yeah. So they're not estero. Elkhorn Slough is an estuary just north of Monterey Bay. And that's where the Monterey Bay Aquarium was releasing a lot of their rehab animals as well as their surrogate raised pups. And they've been doing that for a number of years. And they found that the otters would stay there and really like that estuary environment. And it went from just a few otters in 10 years or so to over 100. And they really did well in that ecosystem. So now future proposed translocations to Northern California and Oregon is really looking at those estuarian habitats as well as the outer coast, because it turns out that the otters do just fine in estuaries. They don't have to be on the outer coast.
Next question. With the reintroduction of otters to Oregon, are you targeting areas that have a kelp forest habitat, or are you focusing on reestablishing the habitat first?
The Alaka Alliance, there's habitat feasibility is part of the feasibility study. So there's a whole chapter on potential habitat for sea otters for the reintroduction. They are looking at the more complex rocky kelp forest ecosystems where there still is some kelp, and they're also looking at those estuarian habitats as well. So there's a number of potential reintroduction sites that they think would be really good habitat for sea otters. And once the sea otters are established, then they will help protect that kelp forest ecosystem and expand the kelp forest habitat. And that's on the Alaka Alliance website, I believe. If it's not now, it's soon. There's a map of potential good habitat for sea otter reintroductions and the likely release sites. And that is also part of the feasibility study that will be open for public comment soon.
Question from Anne Wilkie. California sea otters do not seem to haul out as do those from Alaska. Genetics or habitat?
I firmly believe it's habitat. The Washington otters haul out often, and I believe the southern sea otters, especially in Elkhorn Slough, will haul out there. And I think it's just that maybe in areas of California, there's just a lot of human activity near those nearshore rocks, perhaps, and they just don't want to haul out where there's kayakers all over or something like that. But sea otters are known to haul out throughout their range. And there's very little genetic difference, although there is genetic differences that support stocks with sea otters, but there's really little genetic difference between the subspecies.
Another question, would northern or southern or both groups be considered in Oregon translocation? And I think you might have answered that before saying all
three. They're both on the table. And again, it's really for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to determine which the best source populations will be, and the populations that they will grant permits for translocating. In my opinion, it would be great to have both northern and southern sea otters reintroduced, because that will just hasten the reconnection of the southern and northern sea otters, as well as enhance the genetic diversity of that translocated group.
Two more questions here. Next one from Lisa Carnigan. How is it decided how many otters to move to Oregon, for example? How did you decide how many to take?
In the first translocation?
She doesn't specify, but I think that, yeah.
Yeah, it was over 100 animals that they moved. And that was, I would have to go back into any original documents. This was U.S. Fish and Wildlife, I believe, and USGS, and they were taking advantage of moving otters out of Amchitka specifically because at the time the U.S. government was going to deploy some subtidal nuclear bombs, and they wanted to remove as many, especially marine mammals like sea otters that did not occur in the rest of the United States or North America. So they probably just took as many otters as they could at the time. But I have not seen any documentation that there was, we're going to take 30 here and move them to Washington, and we're going to take 100 here and move them to Oregon. I haven't seen that, but moving forward, I think they're going to try and do multiple translocations into Oregon, such that the potential for multiple efforts for translocation, as well as a larger number of animals, to make sure that it succeeds.
Okay, next question is from Jenny Saxby. What recommendations do you have for increasing the success rate of translocated animals? She doesn't specify otters, but I think maybe generally translocating animals.
I think that especially with well, I really only know about translocating, or have studied translocating sea otters, translocated sea otters. And I think with an animal that is as social as a sea otter, it's really important to take their behavior into consideration. And so translocating them in groups, translocating them in potentially family groupings too, moms with their adult female pups and smaller pups, to really, because the females and their female pups tend to stay together throughout their lives. They're very social. So just taking into account the sea otter behavioral ecology is going to be important. And I think, again, since they're so social, as large a group as possible released at the same time that it's already used to being together, they're less likely to just scatter and try and find home. So that would be my recommendation for successful translocation of sea otters.
And final question here from Janet Mason. Is there any proposal to introduce northern sea otters into the California population to increase genetic diversity?
I do not know the answer to that. I have not heard any talk about, I think I might have talked about it at one of my sea otter conservation workshops, but I don't believe there's any movement there. I think it really is, the movement in California right now is to take some of the otters, or there's a thought of taking some of the otters from Central California and moving them into Northern California, say San Francisco Bay Area, or just to the north into some of those estuaries to try and expand the range. But there's no talk of moving northern sea otters into California that I know of. I think that's really going to come from that Oregon translocation and then having those animals move south.
So much. That's the last of the questions.
Thank you, Eric. I have if I can keep you around a little bit longer, we still have a good 60 plus people watching. Thanks everyone for sticking around. I've got a couple of follow-on questions on some of those. You touched on a little bit in your presentation, but looking kind of forward thinking, this conversation has been sort of, reintroducing them into their already existing, the historical range. And if you were looking in your crystal ball for climate change, obviously sea otters are benefited by the fact that their range is so expansive that builds in some level of resiliency. But are there discussions or considerations for, potential or even somewhere else where they could be translocated sort of out of traditional range in order to build some resiliency? Or is it just the standard create resiliency by dealing with all the threats, bolstering population now and letting them adapt as their own? Specifically raised my question because you blew me away when you talked about how slow range expansion is for these guys. So just curious on that.
Yeah, I think the push right now is to make sure that the previously occupied habitat that remains absent has sea otters. So reestablishing them where they used to be prior to the fur trade is the priority. I guess that's been top of the list because there still is, thousands of miles of unoccupied habitat, specifically between California and Washington. And then there's also the area south of Santa Barbara and San Nicolas into Baja that really doesn't have an established population of sea otters. And then there's also sea otters that are relatively absent from the Queen Charlotte's or Haida Gwaii area of British Columbia, although they're going to get there soon, we think. So yeah, that's a really interesting concept so you're thinking maybe trying to move them, say in the North Bering Sea or something. They've always been near shore, North Pacific Rim, and I don't know why they didn't go farther south in the Western Pacific than Japan. It could be that the water turned too warm there or something, because sea otters, they have this very thick fur coat to stay warm. And then they have this very high metabolic rate, and they really don't like to be in waters that it's too warm, like 65 is about tops for them. So yeah, with a warming ocean, they might need to find some new habitat to the north. But right now the push has been to try and reestablish them in their previously occupied range.
And my last question, and another one popped up in the chat box that we can maybe ask, but just kind of thinking more broadly about sort of, when you talk about the Southern California translocations, it is quite often said that, they failed or they weren't successful or they, and I know part of that stems from the language when they stopped it, just in terms of how it has to be categorized. But I think that there are many things about that translocation that were incredibly informative. They've got viable populations down there and all of these things. And so I think it gets a little bit of a sort of bad rap. but I think part of it is also just what they set up for metrics for success, you know, or expectations that the animals would stay in one particular area rather than move around and those sorts of things. If you were, can you speak to, if you were able to start the translocations into Oregon next year, what would those metrics, kind of short-term, medium-term, and long-term, be for you to say, when we're having this conversation 20 years from now, were these hypothetical Oregon translocations successful? What would measure that?
Yeah, so what we've learned from the other translocations, not only San Nicolas Island, but even Washington, BC, and I can't really speak to Southeast Alaska because that translocation really took off quickly, but certainly in these more linear coast type of environments, it takes 20 to 30 years for it really to take off. So you just have to be patient. So like the San Nicolas population was established in the 80s and it didn't take off until, you know, 5-10 years ago. So it took a solid 30 years where they were just low numbers, you know, in the low 20s just forever. And then all of a sudden it takes off. And the same with Washington, you know, it was pretty low levels of animals for a good 20, 25 years and didn't start taking off and really start growing until the 90s. So you just have to be patient. So, you know, that's the thing is you, and this is addressed in the feasibility study for the reintroduction of otters into Oregon, is that, you know, we may place 100 otters there and maybe, you know, 75 or 50 will survive. If more reintroductions aren't regularly made, you're going to have that same number for decades. And then all of a sudden it's going to hit critical mass and it's just going to take off. So it takes a while for those reintroductions to establish and become successful. But they've become very successful in Washington now and BC, and extremely successful in Southeast Alaska. So people just need to be patient. It'll happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's easier said. I mean, because there is that political component to this. There's that, you know, that the will to do it once you've started it, and to see it through is always part of the gamble.
Yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, I think that, you know, there's some talk about, you know, regularly supplementing the Oregon population until it, to help it, the numbers keep going up. Or it's just monitoring and being patient. And if it starts to crash, you know, maybe then intervening, things like that. But that is all addressed based on the history of the translocations and how they occurred in that feasibility study that's soon to come out. But yeah, many of the successes and failures of the previous translocations are identified in there. And so that people in Oregon should be well informed as to what to expect moving forward with the translocations that we hope will happen.
I was muted. You would think 18 months into COVID, I would know how to unmute myself. But so one last question from Jenny Saxby, which gets a little bit to this metrics of success. The question was, how does the natural mortality rate compare to the mortality rate of translocated otters? And you touched on that a little bit.
You know, I think the natural mortality rate is definitely different for each population. So it's a little bit higher in California just because of shark bites and disease and other things than it is in other areas. And I don't think there's really good, I think the population that we have the best metrics for natural mortality rate is in California. And I don't have that number on the top of my head, but it's certainly higher following the translocations, at least it has been previously. Moving forward, you know, it's just with this new translocation, it's just going to be, it will be done very carefully so that the mortality that has occurred in past translocations that is based on human error doesn't occur again. So being very careful with the way the animals are treated before they're released, making sure that animals are released together in a familial unit, enough of them together, enough of the same age, et cetera, et cetera. I think we'll cut down on the translocation mortality. There's always going to be some mortality from translocations. But yeah, the natural mortality rate for, like, I don't think it's really known for Washington sea otters or a lot of the otters in Alaska, just because it's so hard to get every carcass and then process those animals to know what they died from. But I can say we do know the growth rates, and the growth rate in Washington is 10% per year. So it's definitely increasing, and versus California, which I think has been hovering around 2 to 3% per year with the same reproductive rate. So, yeah.
Apologies for mispronouncing the name probably, but just a comment in the chat from, or in the Q&A from Koru Hattori, just comments: in Japan, recolonization of sea otters is now underway. In recent years, multiple mom pup pairs have been confirmed every year. So.
Yes, I've heard that, and that's really good news. I've also heard that that has caused some concern with Japanese fisheries with just those few otters, and so that always occurs with sea otters recovering. There's always concerns for, especially the invertebrate fisheries, which is what sea otters like to eat. Yes. So, but there'll be more fish. There'll be more fish and bigger fish, and there'll be fewer invertebrates that sea otters like to eat, but they will still be there. And so people just need to learn how to share.
Okay, with that, the very promised final question, not related to sea otters, I doubt, because it pertains to Indonesia. So there was that mysterious comment about you will be soon moving on to a next big thing in Indonesia. And what is that? Yeah,
so the Seattle Aquarium is opening a new building set to open in late 2023, early 2024, and that is the Ocean Pavilion, which will showcase coral triangle animals, fish, invertebrate, sharks, etc. And we're already starting a zebra shark conservation program where we're working with zoos and aquariums across the United States and conservation agencies throughout Indonesia to do another reintroduction to try and reestablish the zebra shark or Stegostoma fasciatum in areas in Indonesia, specifically Raja Ampat, where they have been wiped out due to the shark finning trade. And so these are mesopredators, and once we're helping with the outplanting or reintroduction of those sharks, and I think the first baby sharks are going to be going soon in the next 6 months back to Indonesia to our partners there for reintroduction. And then we want to follow those reintroductions up with ecological studies to see how, just like the sea otters, when you reintroduce a predator, this is a mesopredator, but what happens to the ecosystem? Does it become more stable in the face of climate change? Does it become more complex? So those are one of the ecological and research projects that we want to start in Indonesia soon.
Very cool. If you need a field assistant, I will be happy to travel.
Okay, we'll call you, Charles.
Perfect, perfect. And thank you. The presentation was amazing. Thank you for all the conservation work that you do. If anyone has any follow-up questions, Shawn shared her email earlier. We can post it somewhere as well.
s.larson@seattleaquarium.org.
Perfect. So feel free to reach out, and good luck with all of your future endeavors. And thank you again for publishing in our journal and for sharing your valuable time to share your paper.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to publish in Marine Mammal Science. It's been an honor, and I can't wait to see everybody at the conference in December.
All right. We will be seeing you there.
Right.
Take care until then. And thanks everyone for tuning in. We will announce the next seminar soon. Be safe and well, and I'll see you soon. Aloha.
Aloha.